Okay, George Kirk. He was a special sort of a guy who'd always had a passion for and desire to create artwork. George was the eldest of three brothers born at Bonita. His father was Archibald George and his mother Mary Elizabeth, and they built the house where the boys were all born, and were cattle producers in that area. Even though his life was more about being a businessman and a cattleman and running a cattle property, he, I guess, was influenced by his mother, Mary Elizabeth Kirk, who was also a creative person, and therefore in the family they always valued the arts. And she had been a school teacher at Banban in the long time ago. And so Dad and his brothers were all encouraged to pursue some form of creative work, and Dad was probably the one who maintained it. And
Dad was self-taught. He was just always interested from a young boy to draw, and also his mother drew paint as well, so there was also that artistic side there as well. And yes, and then he met Peter Lindsay when they were in the army together, and I know there was a lot of influence from Peter Lindsay, and they worked together. They were good friends, all through their life.
In the Second World War, he was seconded into the I'm not sure what it's called exactly, intelligence area, where they were illustrating weaponry. And he fortunately ended up working with a man called Peter Lindsay, who was the nephew of Norman Lindsay, and they worked in watercolour. So Dad learned a lot about watercolour from Peter and did pen and ink work, and he at that time was corresponding with my mother, who was a nurse at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and did these really amazing drawings to send to her in these illustrated letters, of which she's kept all of them, of course. And I guess after the war, he was a busy man, being a primary producer, so not a lot of work done for a number of years. And when he started painting again, he probably did some small oils in the interim, and then when he really started getting into painting in the 1970s, he would have started into acrylic on board, and of course then worked on paper and pastel and charcoal on good paper. Did a whole series of pastels when they did a journey out into the centre of Australia, and documented a lot of the beautiful colour and interesting forms, and those forms he brought back into his landscape and applied when he started doing much larger landscapes, which they would have been mixed media, probably a acrylic base and sometimes coming back over with oil on top of that. So he went from a lot of acrylic work into pretty much mainly oil on canvas for his larger works, but the images and the forms of the mountains and things, relating them as bodily form and human form, and the sort of indistinct, is it human, is it landscape concept was very strong in all his landscapes, really. On a weekend, he began getting very serious about it when the cattle industry went downhill in the 1970s. So his view on the world was, well, I can't do anything about changing the landscape in regard to the cattle industry. What I can do is do something that is inspiring and joyful. So he would seriously start painting. He called himself a weekend painter, and built himself a studio on the property. I would go and work with him in his studio at Aruna, and he would, I guess, guide me and And we'd discuss what he was painting, and we'd, you know, stand back and okay, let's put it outside. So we'd take it out into the garden and step back from it and go, oh, how about we turn it upside down? You can see better that way. And just all of those kinds of discussions about the work he'd produced that day, or perhaps he'd encouraged me to have a go at something. They're the fond memories. And then he'd often go from that and go, oh, okay, so he'd pull out his art books, which he had all in his studio, and basically talk me through a lesson. He probably didn't see it that way, but it was just our way of interacting, and focusing on something that he thought was really important rather than the vagaries of the outside world at the time.
I had a little bench in there too, and I used to create candles and copper art jewellery while he's over there painting away. And I think Mum at that time too, she was doing pottery. They used to go to workshops together in Toowoomba, and yeah, she did pottery, so she had a kiln at the back there as well.
You'd just hear music, classical music blaring out of his small studio. It was very tiny, and he'd be humming very loudly as he painted. And he then also started going to flying art school groups around the district, and at times going to McGregor Art School and even UQ, University of Queensland, for some sort of workshops there. There's a few funny stories of him being the boy from the bush down in University of Queensland, driving around in his very noisy GT Falcon around the duck ponds where he'd been drawing and loved it, but he was abused by onlookers who thought back then it was a bit capitalistic to be driving around in that. So he thought it was funny.
I met George in Gayndah. I'd been asked to do the Flying Arts School, and George and Peggy offered wonderful hospitality after a weekend, or whether it was just a day workshop. Now, he was a sort of man that was the bon vivant, you know. He was so welcoming, as was Peggy, and he can't remember a thing about the dinner or what we did, but I can remember very, very vividly the talking afterwards. And it was all about art, and it's always about art. And I found that quite remarkable, that a man like George, who'd come from the land, was really pleased to be able to talk about art.
He loved the country rural lifestyle and animals too, and was interested in different types of plants, and he's done a lot of series of pods, I think they are. He did quite a lot of, you know, the pod series sort of thing, which he was very interested in. So yes, once something caught his eye, he'd really run with it and sort of do it in all different ways sort of thing, yeah.
His artwork was spontaneous, it was colourful, it was cheeky, it was funny. It showed him, you know, he made a bit of a caricature of himself. Always with the hat, and if I remember correctly, rather bosomy ladies if they were in the compositions.
He just found it as a inspiration was about bringing joy into the world and finding interest in a wide range of things. He was obviously a great observer of the landscape and what he saw around him, but he never wanted to represent it in its representational form. He always wanted to take it another step. He wanted to take it further, and it was more about the emotion of it that was important to him. He went from traditional mediums to using computer to create the most amazing coloured works. He also did sculptural pieces at times, and used, early in the 70s, he'd use impasto. So he had this impasto paste, which he'd do relief paintings with and rub back. And I can remember also doing stuff like had timber that he'd burn and he'd rub it back and use that in his work. So he was collaging and applying that to canvases or board.
If anything took his fancy or he was interested in it, he'd work it right through. Sort of, he had, at one stage he had timber which he was burning the edges of. I think I've got one at home. It's a post, but he's glued it onto the painting. There's a funny broken down old cow sort of standing beside it. But yeah, he was using anything really. And I know another one he did, he found a doll, I think it was, and he'd burnt that and he'd had it stuck on a, that was hanging in his studio. He never showed that one, but it was just all, anything he could try, he'd sort of see what he could do with it, sort of thing, yeah.
What he was doing was being pragmatic, as he always was. He didn't feel like he had the energy to be standing in front of an easel down in his new studio in Maryborough. So he sat in his air-conditioned office and utilised what he had, which were, I'd given him a whole stack of drawing books, sketch pads, and some Nico pens for Father's Day, and he used those and he did some really, really fine detailed work of landscapes, but then invented characters and he would take even just a leaf sitting and he'd start drawing it, and then he invented it into a being that became then a character in one of his small drawings, which were all about telling some sort of story. Very fine detail, amazing small detail, which is quite different to some of his earlier big, broad pieces of work. So he covered a very wide range of mediums. Dad ended up producing, I don't know how many, what he called mouse paintings, which was, we loved that play on words, and because he played with language as well. My daughter, who was then only about 4 years old, started just playing around with Paintbox on Dad's computer, and he was taken with what she was doing, so he decided he'd have a go at it. And over the years developed this amazing technique that of producing drawings on, with Paintbox on his computer, which became quite old, but he wouldn't part with because he mastered how to use the mouse and colour and form and how to create a whole very large series of works. And one of the works was Booster the Rooster. So he'd be constantly inventing things like that to amuse my kids and all the grandchildren. And he'd come to our house usually on a Friday night, Mum and he, and we'd all have dinner together, and he'd usually have something like that, Booster the Rooster, in visual form, but he'd also have a poem to go with it, and he'd read it to us around the table, and we'd all sort of sit and laugh and have a lot of fun.
But what I also loved was later on, one of those last exhibitions of his, he'd moved into drawing on the computer. How good's that? He was in his 90s or late 80s, early 90s. And that's an exciting component, to think that someone was prepared to immediately jump any generational gaps and attempt making these drawings on the computer. And I think that just shows the spirit of the man, the if you'd like to say, the creative Australian spirit of using what's around.
And Dad became quite a writer and writing stories, life stories, or a lot of his life stories, and stories of the Gayndah communities and poetry. And yes, he was always writing a lot of funny little ditties to entertain the grandchildren and all of us, I suppose. And he had a few naughty ones, which was, highly entertaining and a bit different for Dad. But yeah, he was really creative. But this is one of Dad's books that he had published, with lots of quirky little poems and stories in it. And I'll just read you a verse out of Dry Ain't It, he said, which is a bit of a local character around Gayndah. So it's about, Dry, ain't it, he said, as he scratched his old head. Water in this here bore never been dry before. He muses as he looks out the door. Them's cattles, they's all wants to be fed. With nary a stick of hay in the shed, high interest at bank makes a man sore. Cripes, that's as much use as a glass dunny door. That's just one verse. There's a few more. Yeah. It was getting harder for he and Mum to travel, where he used to get a lot of ideas from his travelling and for his work, and that became, he wasn't able to do that as much. And exhibitions, well, they're a big job, a lot of work. So Peter set up an Instagram, Facebook, and also he's got his own website as well now, which she monitors still today. A lot of my favourite ones are, of course, the little house in Gympie. There's quite a few here. I've got one he did way back, and I had a dog called Puncho, a little black and tan dog, and that's a collage actually. There's a lot of hessian and cardboard, and so that's my favourite. That's hanging in my bedroom at home. And then the other series following that. Then also Mum and Dad arrived down one weekend to my place and Dad walks in with this colossal big painting. It's a big navy blue with a lot of different coloured cattle, red, yellow cattle. It's very beautiful colours and everything, and my house is just painted white. So he said, this is the only place I thought I could bring this painting to really showcase it and how good it looks. So
I guess for us he was a huge inspiration because of his warmth and positivity and energy in relating to so many people. He thoroughly enjoyed connecting in with particularly the young people, the kids in the family, and more broadly, and but yeah, always open to, connecting with people in his quiet way. He wasn't a loud man at all, but very vivacious.
For artists, it's really lovely if someone can remember you warmly and with generosity, and for a very late night on a lot of really good whiskey. It was good fun, and I think that is the best way that anyone could ever remember George Kirk.